After my wife of 45 years was lowered into the cold earth, I caught my son tearing apart her private study. He found a heavily stamped, cream-colored document hidden in a secret drawer, crumpled it up, and dropped it into the shredder bin. He looked me dead in the eye and said it was just worthless trash that needed to stay buried forever. But he made one critical mistake. He forgot to plug the shredder in. When I took that crumpled piece of trash to the bank the next morning, the branch manager scanned it, locked the heavy doors, and went completely pale. He looked at me with pure terror and whispered that I needed to call the police immediately. The house was suffocatingly quiet. It was the evening of Beatrice's funeral. The last of the mourning guests had finally departed, taking their hollow sympathies and lukewarm casseroles with them. I am 70 years old. I spent 4 decades working as a structural engineer designing steel frameworks for commercial skyscrapers in downtown Chicago. I know how to calculate load-bearing weight. I know exactly how much immense pressure a solid steel support beam can take before it bends and snaps. But walking through the front door of the home Beatrice and I had built together, feeling the crushing absolute weight of her permanent absence, I felt like my foundation was going to break in two. I needed a moment of peace. I just wanted to sit in her private study. I wanted to smell the faint trace of her lavender perfume lingering in the air and listen to the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock she loved so much. I walked down the dimly lit hallway, my heavy footsteps muffled by the thick runner carpet. The solid oak door to her study was slightly ajar. A thin slice of yellow light spilled out onto the dark floorboards. Beatrice always kept this room impeccably dark and locked when not in use. I pushed the heavy door open, expecting to find an empty room illuminated by a forgotten lamp. Instead, I found my only son violating his mother's sanctuary. Preston is 42 years old, the highly successful chief executive officer of a prominent real estate investment fund. He has always worn immaculate bespoke suits and projected an aura of absolute dominance and control. But right now, in the shadows of my wife's study, he did not look like a polished executive. He looked like a desperate thief. He was kneeling on the floor behind Beatrice's antique mahogany desk. The heavy wooden drawers were pulled completely out and tossed carelessly onto the expensive Persian rug, their contents scattered everywhere. He was frantically prying at the false bottom of the lowest cabinet, a hidden compartment Beatrice thought only the two of us knew about. I stood perfectly frozen in the doorway. My profound grief was momentarily eclipsed by pure, unadulterated confusion and rising anger. I watched in silence as Preston wedged a flathead screwdriver under the thick wooden panel. With a sharp, violent crack, the panel splintered and popped loose. He shoved his hand into the dark cavity and pulled out a thick, cream-colored paper. Even from where I stood in the doorway, I could clearly see it was heavily stamped with official, notarized seals. He stared at the document, his breathing shallow, rapid, and erratic. I stepped forward into the room. The floorboard creaked loudly under my weight. Preston jerked his head up. His eyes widened in absolute naked panic. For a fraction of a second, the executive mask slipped entirely, and I saw a cornered, terrified animal looking back at me. But he recovered with terrifying speed. In one fluid, practiced motion, he crumpled the thick paper in his fist, pivoted toward the heavy-duty paper shredder beside the desk, and dropped the document straight into the plastic waste bin. He stood up quickly, wiping the dust from his hands onto his expensive dark trousers, and instantly forced a look of deep, melancholic sorrow onto his face. He let out a long, heavy, theatrical sigh. "What exactly are you doing in here, Preston?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow, scraping against the sudden silence of the room. He stepped forward and placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. His touch felt strangely cold and calculated. "I was just looking for a photo album, Dad. But I found some of Mom's old medical receipts from the 90s hidden deep in that drawer. Seeing them just brought everything back. It hurts too much to look at that painful time in her life." He squeezed my shoulder slightly, his tone dripping with practiced synthetic empathy. "It is just worthless trash, Dad. This stuff should stay buried forever so Mom can finally rest in peace. You look entirely exhausted. Let us get you upstairs to bed. Monica is brewing some hot chamomile tea for you in the kitchen right now. Come on, let us get you out of this room. I looked at my son. I looked at the dark circles forming under his eyes and the subtle, rigid tension in his jawline. I nodded slowly, playing the exact part of the grieving, clueless old man he desperately needed me to be. You are right, son. I am just so unbelievably tired. I let him gently guide me out of the study and up the wooden stairs. But inside, my mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I am an engineer. I do not deal in blind emotions when the structural pieces do not align. I deal strictly in facts, and the facts in that room did not add up at all. First, Beatrice was meticulously organized and incredibly secretive about her finances. She would never ever hide worthless medical receipts in a secret compartment she had custom built. Second, as Preston stood there smoothly lying to my face without blinking, I noticed the thick blue vein on the side of his neck pulsing rapidly, a clear biological sign of a massive adrenaline spike. And third, the most glaring, undeniable fact of all that kept echoing relentlessly in my tired mind. When he dropped that crumpled paper into the shredder, there was no mechanical hum. There was no grinding sound of rotating steel blades. The shredder was completely unplugged. I drank the bitterly cold tea Monica offered me, locked my bedroom door, and waited in the pitch dark. I sat in absolute unmoving silence for 4 hours, listening to the frantic, hushed murmurs of Preston and Monica down the hall, until their bedroom door finally clicked shut. At exactly 2 a.m, I crept back downstairs. I slipped into Beatrice's study, using only the pale moonlight filtering through the window blinds. I reached deep into the unplugged shredder bin and pulled out the crumpled ball of paper. I carefully smoothed it out flat on the desktop. It was not a medical receipt. It was a highly restricted, heavily authenticated, safe deposit box certificate from Chase Bank issued 10 years ago. It bore Beatrice's signature and a bright red embossed stamp that read, Code Red, signaling an absolute emergency protocol that demanded immediate action. The morning air was crisp and biting as I stepped out of the front door, leaving the suffocating silence of my house behind. Preston and Monica were still fast asleep upstairs, likely exhausted from the immense physical effort of pretending to mourn my wife. I slipped the cream-colored certificate into the inner breast pocket of my wool coat, feeling its stiff edge pressing right against my chest. I hailed a passing cab at the corner of the avenue and instructed the driver to take me straight to the main branch of Chase Bank in Oak Brook. I sat quietly in the back of the taxi, watching the city wake up through the smudged window glass. For 40 years, I had made my living analyzing the precise limits of physical structures, calculating exactly how much strain a steel beam could endure before microscopic fractures began to form. Now I found myself calculating the fractures within my own family. My son had tossed a highly restricted financial document into a paper shredder on the very day we buried his mother. He had lied to my face without a single hesitation. The math was incredibly simple, but the terrifying sum of those actions was something I was entirely unprepared to accept. The cab pulled up to the grand glass facade of the bank, just as the heavy doors were unlocked for the morning. I paid the fare and walked inside. The bank lobby was a cavernous, sterile space filled with polished marble floors and the low hum of early morning corporate efficiency. I bypassed the long standard teller lines and walked directly toward the glass-paneled offices in the back. I needed to speak to someone with authority, someone who understood the gravity of the red embossed seal on my document. I approached the largest office. The brass nameplate on the door read, Mr. Mitchell, Branch Manager. Mitchell was a sharply dressed man in his late 50s. He was sitting at his pristine desk, reviewing a stack of morning reports. I knocked gently on the heavy open glass door. He looked up, his face instantly breaking into the practiced, overly warm smile of a seasoned financial executive. He stood up quickly and extended his right hand across the desk to greet me. "Good morning, Sir," Mitchell said smoothly. "How can I assist you today?" I did not return his bright smile. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the crumpled paper, and smoothed it flat onto the polished surface of his desk. I told him my name was Harrison Cole. I told him I needed to access the safe deposit box tied to this specific certificate. It belonged to my late wife, Beatrice. Mitchell nodded politely. "Of course, Mr. Cole. My deepest condolences for your loss. Let me just pull up the account registry and verify the access codes for you. Please take a seat." I sat down in the leather chair opposite him. Mitchell picked up the certificate. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses and ran the document under a small digital barcode scanner on his desk. There was a sharp electronic beep. What happened next defied all logic. As an engineer, I am deeply accustomed to watching environments remain stable. But in a single terrifying fraction of a second, the entire atmosphere of that office violently collapsed. I watched the blood completely drain from Mitchell's face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. His jaw went slack. The practiced, confident smile vanished as if it had been wiped away by a physical blow. A sudden sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He stared at his computer monitor, his eyes wide and completely terrified, his breath catching sharply in his throat. He did not look at me. He dropped the certificate onto the desk as if the paper itself were physically burning his fingers. Mitchell shot up from his leather chair. He stumbled slightly, his knees hitting the edge of the heavy desk. He rushed past me, moving with a frantic, desperate energy. He grabbed the brass handle of the office door, slammed it shut, and twisted the heavy deadbolt. A loud metallic click echoed through the quiet room. Then, with shaking hands, he reached up and yanked the cords to draw the thick privacy blinds tightly shut, entirely cutting us off from the rest of the bank lobby. I stood up from my chair, my muscles tensing, ready for a physical confrontation. I demanded to know what was going on. I demanded to know why he had just locked us inside his office. Mitchell turned to face me. He was trembling. His chest heaved up and down as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He raised both of his hands, palms facing outward in a gesture of pure, desperate surrender. "Mr. Cole," he whispered, his voice cracking and barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning unit. "Please, I need you to stay absolutely calm. Do not move. Do not leave this room under any circumstances. I am calling the federal authorities right now." I stepped forward, my voice hardening into a low, commanding tone. I asked him why he was calling the police over a simple safe deposit box. Mitchell swallowed hard, wiping the sweat from his brow at the back of his trembling sleeve. "Because this is not a simple safe deposit box, Mr. Cole. Your wife came into this exact branch secretly 24 hours before she passed away. She sat right in that chair you are standing next to. She was terrified. She bypassed all of our standard security protocols and explicitly placed a federal alert on this specific box. She mandated that if anyone other than you attempted to access it, we were to trigger a silent alarm directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. My heart hammered against my ribs. I asked him what that had to do with me handing him the paper. I asked him why he looked so profoundly terrified of me. Mitchell backed up against the locked door, gripping the brass handle behind him. "Because of what happened yesterday, Mr. Cole. Yesterday afternoon, right in the middle of the day." He paused, struggling to find breath to finish his sentence. I demanded that he continue. I demanded to know what had happened while I was burying my wife. Mitchell looked me dead in the eyes, his voice laced with absolute dread. "Yesterday afternoon, while you were standing at your wife's funeral, your son Preston marched into this bank. He bypassed the front desk and came straight into my office. He was highly aggressive. He threw a legal document onto my desk and demanded immediate access to your wife's vault. He brought a private locksmith with him, carrying heavy power tools. He demanded that we let him drill the box open. Before I could speak a single word, a massive, violent impact shook the walls. The heavy brass handle twisted back and forth as a familiar voice screamed my name through the thick glass, demanding immediate entry into the room. The extremely demanding voice belonged to my very own son, Preston. The violent pounding on the frosted glass door echoed like gunfire through the small office. Mitchell pressed his back against the mahogany wood. His eyes squeezed shut in absolute terror. The heavy brass handle rattled aggressively as Preston twisted it back and forth. His voice muffled but unmistakable. "Open this door, Mitchell. I know you are in there. I demand to speak with you immediately." I took a step forward, my hands curling into tight fists at my sides. A sudden dangerous heat flared in my chest. My own son was standing just inches away on the other side of that glass, demanding access to a vault he had no right to open, acting like a desperate criminal. I wanted to unlock that door. I wanted to grab him by the collar of his expensive tailored suit and demand to know what he was hiding. But before my hand could reach the deadbolt, a second, much quieter knock came from the opposite side of the room. It was not the main door. It was the private, reinforced steel door at the rear of the manager's suite, a secure exit leading to the employee corridors. Mitchell gasped, jumping away from the glass. The rear door clicked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside. He wore a plain charcoal suit and an earpiece wired discreetly under his collar. His face was entirely devoid of expression, a hardened mask of professional authority. He held up a gold shield encased in a black leather wallet. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling absolute silence, and gestured for me to follow him. We left Mitchell trembling by his desk. The stranger guided me swiftly down a narrow, windowless hallway, away from the echoing sounds of Preston shouting in the lobby. We walked in complete silence until we reached a heavy vault room deep in the subterranean levels of the bank. The air down here was remarkably cold and smelled of ozone and polished steel. The man closed the heavy vault door behind us, sealing us in a perfect, soundproof isolation. He turned to face me, his demeanor softening just a fraction. "My name is Agent Carter," he said, his voice calm and deeply resonant. "I am with the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I apologize for the dramatic exit, Mr. Cole, but your son is highly volatile right now, and a public confrontation is the absolute last thing we need." I stared at the gold shield clipped to his belt, trying to force my analytical mind to process this absurd reality. Yesterday, I was standing over my wife's grave. Today, I was standing in a subterranean bank vault with a federal agent. I asked him what this was all about. I asked him why my wife had placed a federal alert on a safe deposit box without ever saying a single word to me. Carter motioned for me to sit at a small metal table in the center of the vault. He unlocked a black leather briefcase he had carried in with him and pulled out a thick stack of manila folders. "Your wife was an incredibly brave woman, Mr. Cole. She came to us 6 months ago. She suspected that Preston was lying about the actual revenue of his real estate investment fund. She started digging through his discarded mail, his secondary accounting ledgers, and his external server backups. What she found was staggering." He paused, looking at me with a profound sense of pity that made my stomach churn. "The safe deposit box upstairs does not contain cash or family heirlooms. It contains an encrypted hard drive holding thousands of financial records. Your son is not a legitimate real estate tycoon. His entire investment firm is a massive, highly sophisticated money laundering front for a southern cartel. He uses dummy properties and shell corporations to wash millions of dollars in illicit cash." I felt all the air leave my lungs. The sterile walls of the vault seemed to close in on me. Preston, my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the man who hosted charity galas in downtown Chicago, was washing money for a cartel. I shook my head, my logical mind rejecting the premise. I told Carter that Preston was greedy and arrogant, but he was not a hardened criminal. I told him there had to be some kind of mistake. Carter let out a slow, heavy breath and slid a blue folder across the cold metal table. "I wish there was a mistake, sir. But Preston has been losing the cartel's money on terrible investments. He is desperately trying to cover his tracks. And to do that, he needed a scapegoat. He needed someone with a perfect, unblemished credit history and significant legitimate assets to absorb his massive toxic debts. Carter opened the blue folder. Inside were several complex loan agreements, property deeds, and promissory notes. They were all stamped with official bank seals and heavily notarized. I leaned forward, putting on my reading glasses to inspect the paperwork. I looked at the bottom of the first page. I looked at the bold ink signature sitting right above the printed text of my own name. It was a commitment for a $12 million commercial loan, and it was currently in severe default. Carter watched my face closely. He asked me if I had signed those documents. He asked if I had any knowledge of assuming $12 million in high-interest commercial debt. I stared at the dark blue ink on the paper. For 40 years, I worked as a structural engineer. My entire career was defined by absolute, unforgiving precision. Every single time I drafted a blueprint or signed a structural integrity report, my hand moved with deliberate mechanical consistency. I traced my finger over the signature on the fraudulent document. A cold, bitter laugh escaped my throat. I looked up at Carter and shook my head. I told him that I did not sign those papers. I pointed directly at the first letter of the signature. When I write the letter A, my pen creates a strict, rigid 45-degree angle on the crossbar. It is a drafting habit I developed in my 20s, and I have never once deviated from it. I tapped the paper firmly. This angle is completely wrong. It is sloppy and rushed, and the ink viscosity is far too thick for a standard ballpoint pen. This signature was written with a heavy-flow Mont Blanc fountain pen. It is the exact same luxury pen Preston always keeps tucked inside his tailored breast pocket. Carter nodded slowly, closing the folder and sliding it back into his briefcase. He told me that my wife had discovered these forged loans. She was building a comprehensive timeline to hand over to the Bureau so we could protect my assets and put Preston behind bars. But she ran out of time. A sudden violent surge of protective rage ignited in my blood. I stood up from the metal chair, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. I told Carter I was going to walk right back up to that lobby. I was going to grab my son by his throat and demand the truth about what he had done to my name and to his mother. Carter immediately stood up and blocked my path. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip like a vice. He told me that if I walked out there and confronted Preston now, I would be signing my own death warrant. He told me that Preston was backed into a corner by ruthless, violent people who would not hesitate to eliminate a threat to their money. Carter looked at me with absolute, unwavering intensity. He told me that I had to go back to my house. He told me that I had to smile at the man who betrayed me, accept his fake condolences, and play the role of the clueless, grieving old man while the Bureau built their trap. It was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked me to do in my entire life, but looking at those forged signatures, I knew that Carter was entirely right. I had to let Preston believe he had successfully defeated me. I had to let him believe he had outsmarted his grieving, useless father. I slowly sat back down, in the cold metal chair, my hands still curled into tight, trembling fists on the surface of the table. I looked up at Carter and nodded once. I told him that I would play the part perfectly. I would smile. I would stumble. I would act like my mind was slowly unraveling under the weight of my profound grief. But I also made him a promise right then and there. When the trap was finally ready to be sprung, when the federal agents came to tear my son's criminal empire to the ground, I wanted to be the one holding the heavy hammer. Carter did not smile, but a glint of genuine respect flashed in his cold eyes. He nodded his agreement. He reached into his pocket and handed me a small, encrypted burner phone. He told me to keep it hidden at all times and to wait for his signal patiently. I walked out of the bank through the secure rear exit, clutching the encrypted burner phone inside my coat pocket. Carter arranged a discreet black sedan to drive me back to my neighborhood, ensuring no one saw me leaving a federal vehicle. The short ride home felt like traversing an alien landscape. The streets of Chicago looked the same, but the foundation beneath reality had fundamentally shifted. I was returning to a home occupied by a son who forged my signature to satisfy a ruthless cartel. I had to mentally prepare myself before stepping out. I had to actively suppress 40 years of pride. I needed to become the broken, confused, and profoundly useless old man they wanted me to be. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and pushed it open. The house was unnervingly warm, filled with the sweet scent of freshly brewed chamomile tea and the soft crackle of a fire burning in the hearth. Preston and Monica sat close together on the long leather sofa, speaking in hushed, conspiratorial tones. The moment the front door clicked shut, their conversation stopped instantly. They both stood up in perfect unison, pasting identical rehearsed masks of gentle concern across their faces. Dad Preston said, rushing forward to take my coat with exaggerated care. "We were starting to get incredibly worried about you. You wandered off this morning without saying a single word." "Where did you go?" I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing a slight tremor into my hands. "I just needed to walk," I whispered, making my voice sound thin and devoid of energy. "My mind feels like it is wrapped in a thick fog today." Monica stepped out from the living room, holding a steaming cup of tea on a silver saucer. She glided toward me with the calculated grace of a predator cornering wounded prey. She offered me the cup and gently placed her other hand on my forearm, rubbing her thumb in slow circles. "We understand, Harrison," she murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Losing Beatrice has been an absolute tragedy for us. But you really cannot wander the city streets alone like this anymore. It is simply not safe." I let them guide me into the living room and ease me down into my old reading chair beside the fireplace. Preston sat across from me on the coffee table, leaning in close so our knees almost touched. He folded his hands, resting his elbows on his thighs. He looked at me with a deeply manufactured expression of pity. "Dad, Monica and I had a very difficult conversation last night after you went to sleep." Preston began, keeping his tone remarkably steady. "We are looking at reality here. You have been so forgetful lately. You have been misplacing your keys, leaving the stove burners turned on, and struggling to remember basic conversations. The grief is visibly destroying your cognitive functions. We cannot bear to watch you suffer like this." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had never left a stove burner on in my entire life. My mind was sharper than ever. They were actively gaslighting me, trying to construct a false narrative of dementia to justify whatever move they planned next. I forced myself to look away, staring blankly down at the tea in my hands. I nodded slowly, allowing a single pathetic tear to roll down my cheek. I told him that I did feel lost. I told him that I did not know how to function without his mother. "That is exactly why we found the perfect solution," Monica chimed in, leaning over the back of Preston's shoulder. "We secured a spot for you at Sunridge Estates. It is a luxury assisted living community just outside the city limits. You will have a private suite overlooking the gardens, and highly trained medical professionals will monitor your health 24 hours a day. You will not have to worry about cooking, cleaning, or remembering your daily medications ever again. We will take care of absolutely everything." They wanted me out of the house, heavily medicated and completely isolated from the outside world, so they could freely liquidate my assets to pay off their massive illicit debts. I took a slow sip of the chamomile tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my dry throat. I looked back up at Preston and asked him how I could possibly afford a luxury facility like Sunridge Estates on a fixed retirement income. Preston smiled, a smooth, predatory curve of his lips. "That is the easiest part, Dad. You do not have to worry about the financial logistics at all. I am going to handle the entire financial burden." He pulled a thick stack of legal documents from his briefcase and slid them across the glass coffee table until the edges touched my knees. "These are standard estate transfer forms and a comprehensive power of attorney agreement," Preston explained, his voice rushing, slightly eager to close his sinister deal. "If you sign these documents, it grants me the legal authority to manage your banking accounts, handle the property taxes, and eventually sell this house so we can fully fund your permanent care at Sunridge. You can just relax and focus entirely on finding your peace. Just sign right here on the dotted line, Dad." He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy polished Mont Blanc fountain pen. He uncapped it and extended the silver nib toward my trembling fingers. I stared at the pen. It was the exact heavy flow instrument used to forge my signature on $12 million worth of cartel loans. The sheer audacity of my son sitting in my living room using the instrument of my financial execution to demand the total surrender of my life sent a wave of absolute fury coursing through my veins. I wanted to take that heavy pen and drive it straight through his hand into the wooden table. Instead, I reached out and took the cold metal barrel. I forced my hand to shake violently. I let my fingers spasm and slip, dropping the heavy fountain pen directly onto the hardwood floor. It landed with a loud clatter, rolling away under the sofa. "I cannot do this right now, Preston," I whispered. "My hands will not stop shaking. My vision is blurred and I have a terrible headache. I just need to lie down in my bed. Let me sleep for the afternoon. I promise I will sign those papers tomorrow morning." Preston froze. His jaw tightened, and the fake smile vanished for a fraction of a second before he wrestled it back. He bent down, retrieved his pen, and replaced the cap with a frustrated click. "Of course, Dad," Preston said, his tone colder. "Let me help you up." I waved his hands away. I stood up and walked toward the stairs. Pausing on the first step, I glanced into the antique hallway mirror. In the reflection, Monica's sweet mask vanished completely. She glared at my back with pure, unadulterated disgust and violently mouthed a vile curse word. The very next morning, I woke up before the sun even crested the horizon. I did not confront them about the forged documents. I did not demand to know why they wanted to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. Instead, I retreated completely into the quiet, analytical mind of a structural engineer. I stopped asking questions and went into absolute survival mode. When Preston and Monica came downstairs to the kitchen, I was already sitting at the island, staring blankly at a cold cup of coffee. I made my hands tremble slightly as I lifted the mug, playing the part of a broken man whose grip on reality was slipping away. I told them I needed to take a long walk through the neighborhood to clear my heavy head. Preston exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with his wife. He patted my shoulder and told me to take all the time I needed, reminding me to be careful on the uneven sidewalks. I walked out the front door, keeping my pace painfully slow, until I was completely out of their line of sight. The moment I turned the corner, my posture straightened. The manufactured tremor in my hands vanished instantly. I walked 3 blocks, hailed a passing taxi, and directed the driver to a specialized electronics supply store on the other side of the city. I needed tools that were far more sophisticated than standard consumer security cameras. In my 40 years of engineering, I had designed integrated security frameworks for high-rise commercial buildings. I knew exactly what to look for. I moved through the aisles with precise, calculated purpose. I purchased 6 micro cameras, each no larger than a standard shirt button, equipped with high-definition lenses and sensitive low-light sensors. I bought 4 distinct audio bugging devices small enough to be concealed inside a hollowed-out pen. To ensure my network remained entirely undetected by Preston, I purchased a highly encrypted mobile router that would broadcast a private invisible signal directly to my secured burner phone. I paid for everything in cash, using the money I had withdrawn weeks earlier, leaving absolutely no digital paper trail. By the time I returned to the house, the atmosphere was thick with a disturbing, manufactured productivity. Preston and Monica were standing in the main hallway, pulling on their designer winter coats and gathering their expensive car keys. Monica smiled brightly when she saw me holding up a glossy, colorful brochure for Sunridge Estates. She announced they were heading out for the afternoon to shop for my nursing home supplies. She casually mentioned buying me soft slippers and comfortable pajamas, treating my impending institutionalization like a weekend vacation. Preston reminded me to rest and left a pre-prepared lunch on the kitchen counter. They locked the heavy front door behind them, completely confident that their inconvenient problem was finally being handled. The moment the sound of their luxury vehicle faded down the street, my manufactured grief was entirely replaced by mechanical efficiency. I had roughly 3 hours before they returned. I unpacked the electronic equipment onto the dining room table, laying out the tiny micro cameras, audio bugs, and delicate wiring with surgical precision. My hands, which they believed were severely weakened by age and sorrow, moved with the steady, practiced rhythm of a man who had spent his entire life building unbreakable structures. I started in the living room. I pulled over a wooden step stool and carefully unscrewed the metal grating of the central air conditioning vent. I mounted the first micro camera deep inside the dark ductwork, angling the lens perfectly to capture the entire seating area. I wired the power supply directly into the house's electrical grid, ensuring the camera would never run out of battery life. I replaced the grating smoothly, meticulously wiping away any microscopic trace of dust or fingerprints. Next, I moved into Preston's private home office. This was the absolutely most critical location. I needed to capture every single detail of his illicit financial operations. I climbed onto his heavy mahogany desk and removed the plastic cover of the ceiling-mounted smoke detector. I meticulously hollowed out a small section of the internal plastic housing and embedded the second micro camera, pointing it downward to give me a crystal-clear, high-definition view of his computer monitor and his paperwork. I took one of the tiny audio bugging devices and wedged it beneath the lip of his desk, securing it with heavy-duty industrial adhesive. I placed another extremely sensitive audio transmitter deep inside the hollow brass base of a decorative desk lamp. Every hushed conversation, every whispered threat, and every desperate phone call would now be captured in perfect, undeniable clarity. I finished the installation process by securing the final micro cameras in the kitchen and the main hallway, expertly hiding the tiny lenses behind decorative crown molding and inside the outer plastic housing of a wall-mounted digital thermostat. Finally, I went down into the dark basement and installed the encrypted mobile router securely behind the heavy steel casing of the massive water heater. I powered the entire surveillance system on and connected it to the black burner phone Agent Carter had given me. I opened the secure mobile application and watched as 6 crystal-clear, high-definition video feeds simultaneously populated my screen. The audio was incredibly razor-sharp, easily picking up the faint, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the distant hallway. The digital trap was perfectly set, and it was entirely invisible to the naked eye. I cleaned up all of my tools, disposed of the plastic packaging in a public trash dumpster 3 blocks away, and returned to my bedroom just before Preston and Monica unlocked the front door. I spent the remainder of the long evening lying in my bed, staring blindly at the white ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of them moving around the massive house. They brought up a warm tray of dinner, speaking to me in those exact same sickeningly sweet, heavily condescending tones. I ate in absolute silence, keeping my tired eyes cast downward, playing the defeated, helpless victim flawlessly. At exactly 11 o'clock that night, the large house finally grew quiet. I lay in the pitch dark, pulling the heavy blankets up to my chest. I reached under my soft pillow and pulled out the encrypted burner phone. I carefully inserted the small wireless earpiece into my right ear and quietly activated the hidden surveillance application. The screen suddenly illuminated my aged face with a soft, pale, glowing light. I immediately tapped the live video feed broadcasting from Preston's private home office. He was sitting alone at his mahogany desk, bathed in the harsh, uncompromising glow of his large computer monitor. He looked incredibly tense, his shaking fingers drumming a rapid, erratic rhythm against the polished wood. Suddenly, his personal cell phone vibrated violently on the desk. He snatched it up immediately, his face instantly draining of all color. He answered the frantic call, pressing the phone tightly against his ear. The hidden audio feed delivered his terrified voice directly into my waiting ear in perfect absolute clarity. The audio feed crackled to life in my ear, bringing the reality of my son's treachery into the darkness of my bedroom. Through the earpiece, Preston's voice sounded different from the polished executive who had offered me a pen hours earlier. He was breathing heavily, the sound frantic like a man drowning in panic. I kept my eyes glued to the glowing screen of the burner phone, watching the live video feed from his office. Preston was pacing behind his desk, his hand gripping his cell phone so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was speaking to someone. "Listen to me," Preston begged, his voice dropping into a desperate whisper. "I know the deadline was yesterday. I know that. But you have to give me just a little more time. I am so close." The old man is almost broken. The grief has him isolated. A deep, distorted voice on the other end of the line vibrated through the audio bug I had installed beneath his desk. The words were muffled, but the heavy, menacing tone was unmistakable. The caller was not interested in excuses. "I am not lying to you," Preston pleaded. "I just need 3 more days. Just 72 hours. I have the power of attorney documents drafted and ready." He dropped the pen tonight because his hands were shaking, but he promised to sign them tomorrow morning. "Once I have that signature, I hold the legal keys to his estate." I lay perfectly still in my bed, absorbing the sheer magnitude of my child's betrayal. Preston stopped pacing and leaned over his desk, supporting his weight on his free hand. "I have a room waiting for him at a secure psychiatric facility." Preston continued, his tone rapid. "The moment he signs the transfer, the ambulance is coming to take him away. I will have him declared mentally incompetent by the end of the week. He will be locked in a ward, heavily medicated and entirely out of the way. Then I can access his private portfolio." The voice on the phone grumbled something harsh and short. "I know exactly how much I owe you." Preston snapped back, a fleeting flash of arrogance surfacing before being crushed by fear. $12 million. And I am telling you, my father holds 3 times that amount in liquid commercial steel shares. The moment I am his legal guardian, I will liquidate his stock portfolio. The money will be wired into your offshore accounts by Friday afternoon. Just hold your men back. Do not come near my house. Give me the 72 hours. The call ended abruptly, with a sharp click. Preston slowly lowered the phone from his ear. He looked completely shattered, leaning his forehead against the cold screen of his computer monitor. He took a ragged, trembling breath. I watched him on the screen in my hands, a 40-year-old man who had traded his soul and his family for the illusion of wealth, now suffocating under the weight of his greed. Before Preston could regain his composure, the oak door pushed open. Monica strolled into the room. She was wearing a silk emerald robe, looking utterly relaxed. She moved with a casual grace that felt out of place in a room thick with mortal terror. She walked straight to the decanter, picked up a tumbler, and poured herself a generous measure of scotch. The clinking of the ice cubes against the glass rang through my earpiece with terrifying clarity. She took a slow sip, savoring the liquor, and turned to look at her husband. "Why are you sweating like a pig, Preston?" she asked, her voice dripping with lazy amusement. "You look like you are about to have a heart attack." Preston raised his head, his face a mask of exhausted fury. "They are threatening to send someone to the house, Monica. The cartel is losing patience. If he does not sign those papers tomorrow morning, we are both dead. We will lose everything. The house, the cars, our lives. It is hanging by a thread." Monica let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. She walked around the desk and leaned against the edge, crossing her arms. She looked down at him with an arrogant smirk. "You are stressing yourself out over absolutely nothing," she purred. "The old fool does not suspect a single thing. My plan is working perfectly. You saw him tonight in the living room. He could barely hold a pen. He was shaking like a frightened child." Preston rubbed his tired eyes. "But what if he wakes up tomorrow and changes his mind? What if he decides he wants to read the documents before he signs them? He is an engineer. Monica, he spent 40 years reading contracts. If his mind clears for 5 minutes, he will see exactly what we are doing. Monica swirled the scotch in her glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light from the desk lamp. He is not going to experience a moment of clarity, Preston, she said softly. Her tone was completely devoid of human empathy. I made absolutely sure of that. What are you talking about? Preston asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. Monica took another slow sip of her drink and smiled down at him. I took care of the problem 3 days ago, she stated smoothly. I went into his bathroom while he was at the funeral home. I completely emptied out his daily pill organizer. I took all of his prescribed blood pressure medication and threw it straight into the garbage. I swapped every single pill with the heavy sedatives my mother uses for her severe insomnia. They look exactly the same. He has been swallowing them every morning without looking twice. I stopped breathing. The darkness of my bedroom suddenly felt suffocatingly tight. I stared at the glowing screen of my burner phone, my logical mind struggling to process the sheer evil radiating from my daughter-in-law. You switched his medication, Preston whispered, sounding equally shocked and relieved. Monica nodded proudly, setting her empty glass down on the polished wood. Yes, I did. And those sedatives are incredibly strong. They lower the heart rate, fog the brain, and completely destroy short-term memory. That is why he was shaking so badly tonight. That is why he looked so incredibly pathetic. The drugs are already saturating his system. A few more doses and he will not be able to remember his own name. He will be a vegetable by the time the ambulance arrives to take him to the psychiatric ward. She leaned forward, her face hovering just inches from Preston's screen, her eyes gleaming with a monstrous, predatory triumph. It is almost poetic, really, she whispered, her voice slicing through the audio feed like a serrated blade. He is going to lose his mind and fade away into nothing, just like his wife. The silence that followed her words was absolute. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed. The screen of the phone pressed into the palm of my hand. The ambient noise of the house faded away entirely. The blood in my veins turned to solid ice. The revelation hung like a physical weight against my chest. My family was systematically poisoning me. They were erasing my mind piece by piece until nothing remained but a hollow shell they could easily control. I did not sleep. I lay perfectly still, calculating my every move, forcing my heart to slow down. When the pale light of dawn crept through the window blinds, I pushed myself out of bed. I walked into the attached bathroom and locked the door. I opened the mirrored medicine cabinet and reached for the plastic daily pill organizer on the shelf. I stared at the small white tablets inside the compartments. For the past 3 days, I had swallowed these without hesitation. I took one white pill and placed it on the marble vanity. I pressed the base of a shaving cream can against it. The pill cracked and shattered into a fine, chalky powder. I leaned in close and took a slow breath. My standard blood pressure medication was coated and entirely odorless. This crushed powder had a distinct bitter chemical scent that stung the back of my throat. Monica had been telling the truth. She was feeding me heavy sedatives meant to mimic severe cognitive decline. An icy rage washed over me as I scooped the crushed powder into the sink and washed it down the drain. I carefully opened the remaining compartments of the plastic organizer and dumped every single tablet directly into the toilet bowl. I pulled the handle and watched the toxic sedatives vanish into the swirling water. I made sure to leave the empty plastic compartments snapped open on the marble counter, presenting clear, undeniable evidence that I had dutifully taken my morning medication. I splashed cold water onto my face, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I practiced dropping my jaw slightly, letting my eyes glaze over with a vacant stare. I ruffled my gray hair to make it look completely neglected. When I felt confident in my performance, I unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. I forced my posture to slump drastically, dragging my bare feet against the hardwood floor with a shuffling rhythm. I reached the top of the grand staircase and gripped the banister, letting my knees tremble as I slowly descended into the foyer. The house was quiet save for the low hum of the morning news playing in the kitchen. Preston and Monica were sitting at the large granite island drinking coffee and reviewing a stack of paperwork. I shuffled toward the kitchen entrance, making my breathing intentionally loud and ragged. As I rounded the corner, I aimed my shoulder directly at a tall ceramic vase resting on the edge of the console table. I slammed into the table with a highly exaggerated stumble. The heavy ceramic vase tipped over the edge and crashed onto the tile floor, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. The loud, violent noise echoed through the silent house. Preston and Monica jumped up from their bar stools. Preston rushed over carefully, avoiding the broken shards, and grabbed my arm with a firm, controlling grip. "Dad!" he shouted, his voice laced with manufactured panic. "Are you all right? What are you doing walking around like this without calling for help?" I looked up at him, keeping my eyes wide and deliberately unfocused. I let my jaw hang loose. I tried to walk into the kitchen. I mumbled, slurring my words heavily, dragging the syllables out to sound profoundly confused. I could not remember where the coffee was. Everything looked so blurry today. Monica stepped around the shattered vase, a triumphant gleam flashing in her dark eyes, before she replaced it with a look of overwhelming pity. "Oh, Harrison," she cooed, reaching out to stroke my disheveled hair. "You are completely exhausted. The grief is taking a terrible toll on your poor mind. Let us get you seated before you fall." They guided me into the kitchen, treating me like a fragile, broken child. They eased me into a padded chair at the table. Monica quickly swept up the broken shards, while Preston poured a glass of cold water and pressed it into my shaking hands. He leaned against the granite counter, crossing his arms, looking down at me with immense satisfaction. "You really are struggling today, Dad," Preston said smoothly. "I think signing those estate transfer papers is more urgent than ever. We need to get you into Sunridge Estates by the end of the week. You are becoming a danger to yourself." I took a clumsy sip of the water, intentionally letting drops spill down my chin onto my shirt. I bobbed my head like a docile puppet. "I think you are right, Preston," I whispered weakly. "I will sign whatever you need." Preston exchanged a satisfied look with Monica. The trap was working perfectly in their minds. He patted my shoulder and walked to his leather briefcase resting on the edge of the island. He popped the clasps, opening the heavy flap. Before he could pull the transfer documents out, his phone began to ring from inside his jacket. He pulled it out, checking the caller screen. His face paled, losing all its arrogant color. It was the exact terrified expression he wore the previous night. He looked at Monica, his eyes wide with panic. "I have to take this call now," he whispered urgently. "I have to step outside." He did not wait for her response. He spun around and rushed through the patio doors, stepping onto the deck and sliding the glass shut behind him. Monica sighed, rolling her eyes in annoyance. She turned her back to me and walked into the pantry to gather cleaning supplies. The moment Monica disappeared behind the pantry door, the fog of my fake dementia vanished entirely. I sat up perfectly straight, my hands steady and my mind razor-sharp. Preston had left his leather briefcase sitting wide open on the kitchen island. I stood up silently and moved across the room with swift, practiced precision. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted burner phone, opening the camera application. I looked down into the open briefcase. Resting right on top of the fraudulent estate transfer forms was a thick, black, leather-bound ledger book. It was secured with a small silver padlock, but Preston had hastily left it completely unlocked. I carefully flipped open the heavy black cover. The crisp pages were absolutely filled with meticulous handwritten columns, detailing offshore bank routing numbers, massive cash deposits, and explicit lists of untraceable dummy corporations. It was the physical master ledger mapping out the exact structure of his entire cartel money laundering operation. I rapidly snapped a dozen crystal-clear photographs of the highly incriminating pages, ensuring every single routing number and transaction date was captured perfectly. I suddenly heard the brass pantry door handle click. I smoothly flipped the black ledger closed, slipped my phone securely back into my pocket, and silently glided back to my padded chair. By the time Monica walked out of the pantry, I was slumped over the table, staring blankly at the wall, waiting for the trap to close. Preston stepped back through the sliding glass patio doors, slipping his cell phone into his tailored jacket pocket. His face was visibly flushed, carrying the heavy sheen of a man who was rapidly running out of time. He walked over to the kitchen island and snapped his leather briefcase shut, completely unaware that the physical proof of his entire criminal enterprise now safely resided inside the encrypted memory of my hidden burner phone. Monica emerged from the pantry, holding a pristine white cloth, wiping her hands with practiced elegance. They did not even bother to look in my direction once. They simply assumed I was entirely incapacitated, completely lost to the heavy chemical sedatives currently dissolving inside the city sewer system. Monica tapped Preston on his shoulder and quietly announced that they needed to leave immediately for Sunridge Estates. She explained that they had to finalize the residency paperwork and secure the medical transfer mandates before the end of the afternoon. Preston eagerly agreed, gripping the brass handle of his briefcase with white knuckles. They whispered their swift goodbyes to me, treating me like a deaf ghost haunting my own kitchen. The heavy front door clicked firmly shut once again. The moment the locking mechanism engaged, my entire posture transformed. I stood up from the padded chair, my mind functioning with the ruthless precision of a military operation. I walked briskly into the hallway, grabbing my wool winter coat and a thick scarf. I bypassed my own vehicle parked in the driveway, knowing Preston might have installed a GPS tracking device. Instead, I walked 3 blocks down the quiet suburban street and summoned an anonymous ride-share vehicle through my secure phone. I instructed the driver to securely take me straight toward the Federal Plaza located in downtown Chicago immediately. The ride into the bustling city felt agonizingly slow. I sat silently in the back seat, watching the gray winter clouds gather over the towering glass skyscrapers. My thumb absent-mindedly traced the smooth screen of my phone, guarding the digital photographs that would permanently destroy my own son. When the driver finally pulled up to the massive federal building, I paid in cash and walked through the heavy revolving doors. I approached the armored security checkpoint and clearly stated my name, requesting immediate access to Agent Carter of the Financial Crimes Division. The armed guards moved with extremely practiced efficiency. Within 5 minutes, I was escorted onto a private, secure elevator that ascended rapidly to the upper floors of the Federal Bureau. The steel doors slid open, revealing a highly active bullpen filled with analysts ringing telephones and glowing computer monitors. Agent Carter stood waiting at the end of the corridor. He looked genuinely shocked to see me standing there, functioning perfectly, devoid of the trembling grief I had displayed in the bank vault just yesterday. I walked straight past his outstretched hand and followed him directly into his private soundproof office, shutting the heavy wooden door securely behind us. I did not waste a single second with any pleasantries. I reached into my coat, pulled out the encrypted burner phone, and laid it firmly onto his metal desk. I told him that I had captured the master ledger. I explained how Preston had carelessly left his briefcase unlocked while answering a frantic call from his cartel handlers. Carter's professional mask cracked, revealing a flash of absolute astonishment. He grabbed the phone, rapidly swiping through the high-definition photographs of the handwritten accounting columns. His breath caught sharply as he fully scrutinized the highly detailed routing numbers and dummy corporations. "This is the Rosetta Stone," Mr. Cole Carter whispered. His eyes locked onto the glowing screen. These specific numerical sequences match the exact banking institutions we have been monitoring for the past 3 years. This is enough evidence to legally subpoena the contents of the vault right now. Carter moved with lightning speed. He sprinted out of the office to consult with a federal judge. Less than an hour later, I was sitting in a subterranean evidence room alongside Carter and an armed tactical squad. A specialized technician placed a heavy gray metal lockbox squarely onto the steel tabletop. This was the exact box my wife had desperately protected. Carter used a specific sequence of numbers recovered from Preston's master ledger to bypass the final secondary locks. The heavy steel lid swung open with a dry mechanical squeak. Inside the velvet-lined interior, there was no cash, no jewelry, and no final written letter. There was only a single solid-state hard drive wrapped in a protective anti-static envelope. Carter carefully extracted the drive using gloved hands and connected it directly to a massive standalone federal decryption terminal. The machine whirred loudly to life, processing the intricate security. The decryption process took nearly 20 agonizing minutes. When the progress bar finally reached 100%, a sprawling directory of digital folders populated the bright screen. The sheer volume of data was incredibly staggering. My brave, beautiful Beatrice had spent the last 6 months of her life operating as a silent, invisible auditor inside her own son's company. She had meticulously copied thousands of internal emails, property foreclosure notices, and hidden wire transfer receipts. We opened the primary folder labeled Acquisitions, and the horrifying depth of Preston's moral depravity was finally laid bare under the harsh fluorescent ceiling lights. Preston was not simply buying commercial real estate to launder the cartel's illicit cash. He was actively purchasing vulnerable, low-income senior living facilities and working-class apartment complexes. Once he gained complete ownership, he systematically orchestrated ruthless, illegal evictions. He manipulated lease agreements to forcibly remove the elderly residents, stealing their pension deposits and draining their remaining retirement savings through exorbitant fraudulent administrative fees. He utilized these stolen funds to create massive phantom revenue streams, perfectly obscuring the dirty cartel money moving seamlessly through his corporate accounts. He was destroying innocent lives to completely mask his vast criminal empire. I stared at the glowing monitor, feeling a wave of absolute sickening revulsion wash over my entire body. My son was a monster. He had willingly sacrificed the safety of helpless elderly individuals just to cover his own pathetic, massive financial failures. Beatrice had seen all of this. She had sat in the quiet solitude of our home, sifting through the digital evidence of her own child's horrific cruelty. The immense psychological burden she must have carried during those final 6 months was completely unimaginable. I pressed my hands against my face, trying to contain my violently soaring parental fury. Carter remained absolutely silent, his face a tight mask of professional outrage as he scrolled through the endless lists of ruined fees. He clicked out of the main directory and navigated toward the very bottom of the expansive screen. There, isolated from the rest of the highly structured financial data, was a single separately encrypted folder. The digital creation stamp displayed a very specific, chilling date. It was labeled March 12th. That was the exact date of my wife's sudden, unexplained death. Carter double-clicked the bright yellow icon. The folder quickly opened, revealing one single, highly compressed audio file. The media player opened on the decryption terminal with a stark white flash displaying a flat digital sound wave across the monitor. Agent Carter pressed the spacebar and the tiny speaker crackled to life. A harsh burst of static hissed through the quiet evidence room, followed immediately by the familiar heavy acoustic resonance of my own living room back home. My breath caught. The first sound I heard was the unmistakable rapid clicking of my wife's shoes pacing across the hardwood floor. Then her voice broke the silence. Beatrice sounded terrified, but beneath the terror was a fierce core of maternal outrage. Her voice trembled, yet every single syllable was deliberately articulated. "I know exactly what you are doing," Preston Beatrice said, her voice echoing slightly in the recorded space. "Do not lie to my face. I found the hidden server backups. I traced the dummy shell corporations. I know about the apartment complexes you are buying on the south side. I know you are forcing those poor elderly people onto the freezing streets so you can siphon their pension funds and wash illicit money for criminals." A long, tense silence stretched across the audio recording. I stared blankly at the sound wave on the monitor, watching it flatline for agonizing seconds. When the audio finally spiked again, the voice that emerged did not sound like my son at all. It was utterly devoid of any warmth, hesitation, or human empathy. It was the absolute dead metallic tone of a seasoned sociopath who had just been cornered by a threat he needed to completely eliminate. "You should have kept your nose out of my business," Mother Preston replied, his voice chillingly calm. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with right now?" Do you have any concept of the massive scale of this financial operation? If you say a single word about those properties to anyone, the people I work for will not just kill me. They will come to this house and they will slaughter you and Dad without a second thought. You are putting our entire family in fatal danger by running your mouth about things you do not understand. I am putting this family in danger, Beatrice shouted back, her voice raising an octave shattered by the absolute betrayal of her only child. You are a monster, Preston. You are destroying innocent, vulnerable people who cannot fight back. You are a disgusting parasite. I have transferred every single piece of data onto a secure, encrypted hard drive. I am taking this directly to the federal authorities right now. I will not let you use our family name to hurt another living soul. I do not care if they lock you in a federal cell for the rest of your natural life. You need to be stopped. The sound of high heels aggressively clicking across the floor interrupted the confrontation. It was Monica. She laughed, a short, sharp, entirely wicked sound that sent a fresh wave of ice flooding straight through my veins. You are not going anywhere, Beatrice. Monica sneered, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. You are an obsolete, meddling old woman, and you are going to sit down and keep your pathetic mouth shut. The audio suddenly shifted. The sound of rapid, heavy footsteps echoed through the speakers, followed by a harsh, violent scuffle. Beatrice let out a sudden, terrified gasp. I heard someone being shoved aggressively against the wooden furniture. A chair scraped loudly across the floorboards. Get your hands off me, Beatrice gasped. Her voice was suddenly strained, tight, and painfully thin. I could vividly picture her clutching her chest, a familiar gesture that preceded her angina attacks. Preston let go of me. I cannot breathe properly. Let me go to my purse. I need my medication right now. The audio recording captured the frantic, desperate sound of my beautiful wife pulling heavily at her restricted lungs, desperately fighting for a single breath of oxygen. She was having a massive, catastrophic cardiac event right there in our living room. My hands gripped the edge of the cold steel table so tightly that my knuckles ached. I wanted to reach through the monitor and tear my son to pieces. I waited for Preston to call for an ambulance. I waited for him to show one singular ounce of basic human decency. Instead, Preston's voice drifted through the speaker, low, steady, and utterly devoid of mercy. You are not going to the police, Mom, he stated coldly. You are having a severe, unexpected heart attack. It is a terrible, unpredictable family tragedy. And I know you are having a heart attack right now because Monica and I completely emptied your purse. We threw every single one of your life-saving nitroglycerin pills directly into the basement incinerator over an hour ago. You do not have any medication left. A horrifying, wet, choking sound tore from my wife's throat. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor. The microphone picked up the awful, desperate sound of her fingernails scratching weakly against the polished wood as she suffocated in her own failing body. She tried to speak, tried to formulate a final plea for mercy, but she could only produce a terrifying, breathless rattle. Come on, Preston, Monica whispered casually, her voice moving further away from the hidden microphone. Let us step outside onto the patio for 10 minutes. Let nature take its course. We can call the paramedics when she stops moving entirely. The final devastating seconds of the audio recording were a symphony of pure, unadulterated nightmare. I listened to the sound of Preston and Monica walking calmly away. I heard the heavy patio door slide open and click firmly shut, completely sealing my dying wife inside. Then I was forced to listen to the brutal, lingering silence. I listened to Beatrice gasping, fighting alone, her breath growing weaker and weaker, until there was absolutely nothing left but a dead, empty static hissing from the speaker. The audio file ended. The decryption terminal monitor went entirely black. Agent Carter sat heavily in his metal chair, his eyes wide and completely horrified. He slowly reached out and muted the speakers, his hand visibly shaking. He had spent years pursuing violent cartel enforcers, but the raw, casual cruelty of a son deliberately murdering his own mother had clearly shaken him to his absolute core. He looked at me, his mouth opening to offer some kind of hollow comfort, but he stopped when he finally saw my face. I did not shed a single tear. The initial suffocating wave of profound grief that had haunted me for days was instantly incinerated by an overpowering, blinding heat. It was a cold, calculating, and absolutely weaponized rage. My sorrow evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, brilliant clarity. I was no longer a grieving widower. I was an engineer, and I was going to dismantle the foundation of my son's existence until nothing remained but rubble. I stood up, my posture perfectly straight, my hands incredibly steady. I looked Carter directly in his eyes, my voice dangerously calm. I do not want him arrested yet, Carter. I want to ruin him first. I left the massive federal plaza with a singular, cold, and entirely unbreakable focus. The profound, paralyzing grief that had weighed down my chest was now completely gone, replaced by the calculating machinery of my engineering mind. Agent Carter had tried to argue with me, citing strict federal protocol and the immediate danger of the ruthless cartel. But he saw the absolute zero in my eyes. I was not asking for his permission. I hailed a cab in the freezing Chicago wind and gave the driver an address in the financial district. I was not going home to cower in my bed. I was going to see Thomas Bennett. Thomas was not a standard corporate attorney. He was a ruthlessly efficient legal architect who specialized in dismantling corporate takeovers and burying financial predators. We had worked together 30 years ago when a rival firm tried to steal my foundational patents. He practiced law to completely annihilate his opposition. The cab dropped me off in front of a sleek, black glass high-rise. I bypassed the security desk using my old access codes to reach the top floor. Thomas was sitting behind his sprawling obsidian desk when I walked in. He looked exactly the same as he did 3 decades ago, sharp, unblinking, and radiating a quiet, lethal intelligence. He took one look at my face and instructed his secretary to hold all calls. I sat down in the leather chair across from him and laid everything out on the table. I told him exactly what they had done to Beatrice in her final moments. I told him about the cartel, the fraudulent loans, the forged signatures, and the sedatives Monica was slipping into my pills. Thomas did not gasp or express shock. He did not bother to offer empty, meaningless condolences. He simply picked up his silver pen and began writing down specific, tactical notes. When I finished, the silence in the office was thick and heavy. Thomas looked up, his dark eyes locking onto mine. He leaned forward and asked me exactly how far I was truly willing to go. I told him I wanted to tear my son's entire existence down to the bedrock and salt the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. Thomas smiled. It was a cold, incredibly dangerous smile. "First, we secure your legitimate foundation," Thomas stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Preston wants to declare you mentally incompetent so he can drain your commercial steel shares to pay off his cartel handlers. We are going to sever his access permanently." Thomas drafted a highly complex, irrevocable blind trust. He transferred 100% of my liquid assets, my property deeds, my commercial patents, and my investment portfolios directly into this impenetrable legal fortress. By the time I signed the final page, my entire net worth was locked away behind a maze of international corporate protections that Preston could never, ever penetrate. Even if he successfully convinced a crooked judge to grant him medical guardianship, he would find absolutely nothing. My bank accounts would be completely empty. My house would legally belong to an anonymous offshore holding company. He was trying to drain a reservoir that I had just turned into a desert. But simply protecting my assets was not enough. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Preston had eagerly shoved into my hands that very morning. I smoothed the crumpled pages onto Thomas's desk. "This is the power of attorney and the estate transfer." "Preston wants me to sign," I explained. "He expects me to hand over the legal authority of my life so he can save his own." Thomas picked up the fraudulent documents, his eyes scanning the aggressive legal jargon. A dark, brilliant idea began to form in the space between us. Thomas stood up and walked over to his heavy printing station. He told me that Preston had made a fatal, arrogant mistake. In his desperate rush to secure the cartel money, he had used a standard unbound legal template. The pages were merely stapled together, not officially bound by a registered notary. Thomas expertly removed the heavy metal staple. He separated the first page, which bore the standard title of a medical and financial power of attorney, and the final page, which required my witnessed signature. Then, drawing on his decades of ruthless legal warfare, Thomas drafted a completely new set of middle pages. He utilized the exact same font, the identical margin spacing, and the precise legal formatting of Preston's original document. However, the internal language was fundamentally and catastrophically altered. Instead of granting Preston control of my estate, the new middle pages constituted a sworn binding confession. It detailed Preston's sole responsibility for the forged commercial loans. It legally bound the $12 million cartel debt entirely and irrevocably onto his personal Social Security number and his private holdings. It completely indemnified me from any and all financial actions executed by his real estate firm. Thomas utilized a brilliant sleight-of-hand binding technique. He seamlessly inserted the new pages between the original cover sheet and final signature page, pressing a new staple through the exact microscopic holes. On the surface, it looked perfectly identical to the document Preston had given me, but inside it was a flawlessly crafted legal guillotine. I carefully placed the newly forged weapon back into the inner pocket of my winter coat. I thanked Thomas for his absolute loyalty and walked out of the high-rise building, stepping back into the freezing Chicago air. My mind was perfectly clear, humming with the cold, unforgiving precision of a steel beam taking on immense structural weight. I hailed another taxi and instructed the driver to take me back to my quiet suburban neighborhood. I arrived at the house just as the winter sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the warm foyer, immediately letting my shoulders slump forward. I dragged my feet across the hardwood floor, carefully reconstructing the pathetic, broken posture of a man whose mind was rapidly deteriorating. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water with violently trembling hands, waiting patiently for my predators to arrive. Less than 10 minutes later, the distinct sound of their luxury vehicle pulling into the driveway echoed through the silent house. The lock clicked and the heavy door swung open. Preston and Monica walked inside, bringing a blast of freezing wind with them. They looked energized, their faces flushed with the thrill of their impending victory. Preston threw his expensive car keys onto the console table and walked directly toward the kitchen, completely unaware of the lethal trap waiting inside my coat. Monica followed closely behind him, her dark eyes gleaming with malicious excitement. She stopped at the edge of the granite island and looked at me, completely ignoring my trembling hands. She lifted her arm and proudly displayed a freshly printed, glossy, full-color brochure. The bold lettering across the front cover prominently advertised the secure psychiatric ward at Sunridge Estates. I stared at the brochure, widening my eyes in manufactured confusion. I let my jaw hang loose as if processing a photograph required immense cognitive effort. Monica smiled, her tight lips barely concealing utter contempt. She patted my trembling shoulder and announced dinner, speaking to me like a deaf toddler. Preston walked past me, his mind preoccupied with the financial fraud he was desperately trying to finalize. Deep within my chest, the perfectly forged legal document rested securely inside my coat pocket. It was a loaded weapon, silently waiting to detonate. Every step I took toward the dining room table was a meticulously calculated performance. Tonight was the final supper, the absolute climax of my 40 years as an engineer. I was building a cage for my own son, and I needed him to walk willingly into the steel teeth. I took my seat at this mahogany table. Preston sat to my right, Monica directly across. They laid out the dinnerware with impatient energy, completely bypassing the usual pleasantries. I picked up my fork, intentionally gripping it with unnatural stiffness. I let my hand shake violently as I attempted to pierce a piece of chicken. The metal tines clattered loudly against the smooth ceramic plate. I brought the food to my mouth purposely, letting a small piece fall back onto the tablecloth. Preston let out a heavy, irritated sigh, vigorously rubbing his temples. He did not bother to hide his profound annoyance. He stared at me with cold, calculating eyes entirely devoid of familial warmth. He was looking at a nuisance, a temporary roadblock standing between him and his $12 million salvation. I continued to struggle with my food, making small, confused noises in my throat. I was actively pouring gasoline on the fire of their impatience. Monica reached for the salt shaker. I looked directly at her, narrowing my eyes, as if violently struggling to pierce through a thick mental fog. I tilted my head, letting a profound look of bewilderment wash over my aged features. "I am sorry," I mumbled, making my voice sound thin, weak, and rasping. "I know you are a friend of Preston, but I simply cannot seem to recall your name tonight." "Have we met before?" Monica froze immediately, her hand hovering awkwardly over the salt shaker. Her face flushed with a vicious flash of pure anger. She looked at Preston, her dark eyes silently screaming absolute frustration. "I am Monica Harrison," she stated, her voice incredibly tight and severely strained. "I am your daughter-in-law. I am married to your son. I have lived in this house with you for 5 years." I blinked rapidly, rubbing my forehead with a violently trembling hand. "Monica," I repeated softly, slurring the vowels. "Right. Monica, forgive me. My mind is incredibly clouded today. I thought Beatrice was going to join us for dinner tonight. Where is Beatrice?" The sudden mention of my murdered wife caused a sharp, sudden silence to fall over the room. Preston dropped his silverware with a loud clatter. He glared at me, his jaw clenched tightly. He had finally reached his absolute breaking point. He pushed his chair back roughly and stood up. He snatched the stack of legal documents from the edge of the console table where I had deliberately left them earlier. He did not know these specific pages had been meticulously gutted and restructured by Thomas Bennett just hours ago. He slammed the paperwork down directly in front of my dinner plate, the heavy pages echoing with a dull thud against the wood. "That is enough, Dad." Preston barked, his voice rising in volume, entirely abandoning his previous facade of gentle concern. "You are completely losing your mind. You do not know where you are. You do not know who my wife is. You cannot even feed yourself properly. You need permanent professional care immediately. This is not up for debate anymore." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen. He slammed it down violently on top of the forged trap. "Just sign it, Dad. Sign the power of attorney right now. I will handle the massive financial burden. I will make sure you are locked safely away at Sunridge Estates. You are a danger to yourself, and this is for your own good." I stared down at the legal trap resting beneath the harsh overhead light. My heart raced, but my mind was incredibly calm. I reached out for the heavy fountain pen, letting my fingers tremble violently. I deliberately let my right elbow strike the large crystal water goblet resting next to my plate. The heavy glass tipped over, immediately spilling a massive wave of ice water directly across the table and straight onto Preston's lap. The freezing liquid soaked instantly into his incredibly expensive trousers. Preston leaped out of his chair, shouting a harsh, violent curse word. Monica gasped loudly, jumping up to grab a stack of linen napkins from the wooden sideboard. Complete domestic chaos erupted in the dining room. Preston was completely distracted by his own shallow vanity. In that exact fraction of a second, my manufactured tremor completely vanished. My right hand gripped the pen with absolute rigid strength. I quickly flipped to the final signature page of the lethal document. I pressed the silver nib against the paper and signed my name with perfect, unforgiving precision. I utilized my signature 45-degree angle on the crossbar of the letter H, permanently cementing the legal validity of the sworn confession. I seamlessly flipped the page back, laying the pen neatly across the top, just as Monica turned back around with the damp napkins. I slumped deeply back into my chair, letting my jaw hang loose, resuming the role of the broken, terrified old man. Preston furiously threw his wet napkin onto the table, glaring at me with undisguised malicious hatred. He lunged forward, and roughly snatched the signed document directly from the table surface. He quickly flipped to the final page, his eyes locking onto my fresh ink signature. A sudden wave of profound relief completely washed away his intense anger. A triumphant, sinister smile spread across his face. He possessed my signature. He believed he now held the legal keys to my entire financial empire. He had absolutely no idea he had just officially accepted complete legal liability for $12 million of highly dangerous cartel debt. Preston placed the heavily forged document into a protective leather folder. The shift in his demeanor was instantaneous. He completely ignored my presence. He walked over to the sideboard and proudly pulled out a bottle of chilled vintage champagne. He grabbed 2 crystal flutes, completely neglecting to offer me a glass. The loud celebratory pop of the cork echoed sharply through the otherwise quiet dining room. He poured the bubbling champagne, handing a glass to his eagerly smiling wife. They gently clinked their tall glasses together, a silent, sickening toast to their successful treason. Preston leaned in close to Monica's ear, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper that my hidden audio bugs captured perfectly. "Pack his bags tonight," Preston commanded coldly, sipping his champagne. "The private ambulance comes to take him away at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." I kept my heavy head bowed, staring blankly down into the shallow puddle of spilled water resting on the mahogany table. I slowly wrapped my shaking hands around my completely empty glass. Safely hidden beneath the shadow of my drooping face, a cold, incredibly genuine smile pulled at the corners of my mouth. The night passed with agonizing slowness. I did not sleep. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, watching the luminous green numbers on my digital alarm clock shift minute by minute. Every tick was a reminder of the monumental reckoning that was about to arrive. When the first pale streaks of dawn finally broke through the winter clouds, I stood up. I dressed in a sharp, tailored wool suit, the exact kind of suit a competent, powerful executive would wear to a board meeting. I ignored the ragged sweaters Monica had laid out for me. I packed a small canvas duffel bag with a few personal items, a symbolic prop for the performance I was about to deliver. I looked at the framed photograph of Beatrice resting on my mahogany nightstand. Her warm smile gave me an immense surge of profound strength. I whispered a final promise to her memory, guaranteeing that justice was arriving today. I gripped the leather handle of the duffel bag, opened my bedroom door, and stepped out into the long, carpeted hallway. The house was entirely silent, save for the low, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the downstairs foyer. I walked toward the grand staircase, my footsteps muffled by the thick fabric. I did not shuffle. I did not slump my shoulders. I walked with the firm, unyielding posture of a man who was entirely in control of his own destiny. However, as I reached the top of the stairs, I deliberately let my shoulders drop. I hunched my back, letting the canvas duffel bag drag slightly against my leg. I forced my hands to shake, reinstating the facade of a broken, confused old man about to be shipped away. I slowly descended the stairs, listening closely to the murmurs coming from the kitchen. Preston and Monica were already awake, their voices buzzing with a nervous anticipation. They were dressed immaculately, preparing to put on a public performance of grief for the neighborhood. I reached the bottom step and walked into the entryway, letting my bag drop to the floor with a pathetic, heavy thud. Preston and Monica stepped out of the kitchen, both holding steaming mugs of black coffee. Monica was wearing a dark, modest dress, her face wiped clean of her usual heavy makeup, looking appropriately somber and exhausted. Preston wore a sharp navy blazer, his hair perfectly styled. He checked his expensive gold wristwatch, tapping his Italian leather shoe impatiently against the floorboards. The digital clock on the wall shifted to exactly 8 in the morning. Right on schedule, the heavy crunch of large tires rolling over the gravel driveway echoed through the front windows. A large, dark vehicle had pulled up directly in front of the house. Preston immediately set his coffee mug down on the console table. He turned to Monica and gave her a sharp, affirming nod. They both walked over to the large front door and pulled it open, stepping out onto the front porch to ensure any watching neighbors could see their manufactured sorrow. Monica pulled a white tissue from her pocket and dabbed softly at her completely dry eyes. I stood quietly in the foyer, staring blankly at the open doorway. Preston turned back toward me, the facade of a grieving son instantly vanishing the second he faced the interior of the house. He marched across the threshold, his face contorted into a mask of pure, undisguised contempt. He reached out and grabbed my right arm with a brutal bruising force, his fingers digging deeply into my bicep. "Time to go, old man!" Preston hissed, his voice a lethal vibrating whisper meant only for my ears. "You are finally out of my way. Do not cause a scene, or I swear I will make sure the nurses sedate you into a permanent coma." I let my jaw tremble, looking up at him with wide manufactured terror. I allowed him to drag me forward, my feet stumbling clumsily over the doorframe as he pulled me out into the freezing morning air. The biting wind whipped across the porch, but I barely felt the cold. My entire focus was locked onto the large black tactical vehicle idling silently in the driveway. It was not a white ambulance. There were no flashing red lights, no medical insignias, and no paramedics waiting with a sterile stretcher. It was a massive, heavily armored federal transport vehicle with deeply tinted, impenetrable windows. Preston stopped abruptly at the top of the porch stairs, his grip on my arm loosening slightly as severe confusion washed over his rigid face. He frowned, leaning forward to inspect the unmarked vehicle. The heavy metal doors of the dark transport swung open in perfect unison. 4 men stepped out onto the gravel. They did not wear medical scrubs. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy ballistic vests, and secured sidearms. Leading the group was Agent Carter, his federal badge gleaming brightly against his dark jacket. Standing immediately to his right was my ruthless private attorney, Thomas Bennett, holding a thick leather briefcase. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of their arrival hit the driveway like a physical shockwave. They spread out, forming a highly disciplined tactical perimeter around the bottom of the porch stairs. I stood perfectly still on the porch, the freezing winter wind pulling at the edges of my tailored wool coat. I did not stumble and I did not shake. The pathetic facade of the broken, terrified old man melted away instantly, revealing the cold, calculating engineer underneath. I straightened my spine, pulling myself up to my full height, and stared directly into my son's terrified eyes. The look of absolute horror that washed over Preston's face was a masterpiece of poetic justice. He realized in that exact, devastating fraction of a second that the trap he thought he had built for me was actually the cage I had forged for him. Agent Carter stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly against the frozen gravel, his hand resting casually upon his utility belt. The heavy morning air felt incredibly thick, vibrating with the undeniable promise of long overdue absolute vengeance against my son. Preston froze completely, his entire body locking up in absolute terror. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, hollow ghost. He released my arm entirely, staggering backward until his spine hit the solid brick pillar of the front porch. Monica dropped her white tissue, her mouth falling wide open in a silent, horrifying scream as she finally recognized the bright yellow letters printed boldly across the agent's tactical vests. The absolute, undeniable reality of the situation crashed down upon them, completely shattering their pathetic illusion of supreme control. But Preston, ever the calculating manipulator, frantically attempted to salvage the broken situation. He threw his hands up into the freezing air, instantly shifting his posture into a pose of desperate surrender. He forced a frantic, panicked smile onto his face, looking directly at Agent Carter with incredibly wide, pleading eyes. "Officers," he shouted, his voice shaking with a pathetic, desperate energy. "Thank God you are here. My father is having a severe psychotic break. Please take him away." The freezing wind whipped across the porch, carrying the pathetic echo of my son's lie. Preston tightened his bruising grip on my bicep, attempting to pull me toward the armored vehicle. He expected the sedated old man to stumble forward and surrender to the madness. He expected me to crumble. Instead, I planted my feet onto the frozen floorboards. I twisted my arm inward and ripped it away from his grasp with a terrifying burst of strength. The resistance threw Preston off balance. He stumbled backward, his leather shoes slipping against the frost-covered planks. He caught himself against the brick pillar, his mouth hanging open in shock as he looked at me. I did not slump my shoulders. I did not let my jaw tremble or my eyes wander. I stood perfectly straight, pulling myself up to my full height, casting a long, imposing shadow over him. The fog of dementia evaporated from my face, replaced by the lethal, focused clarity of a man who had successfully engineered his own salvation. I stared down into Preston's terrified, widening eyes. "I am entirely sane, Preston," I stated, my voice echoing with a deep authority that cut straight through the freezing air. "But you are entirely out of time." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed him. The certainty in my voice had paralyzed him. He looked desperately toward Agent Carter, hoping to find a sympathetic ear. But Carter did not look confused. The federal agent stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly over the gravel. He reached inside his dark jacket and retrieved a folded stack of white paper. He extended his arm and shoved the documents into Preston's chest. Preston instinctively raised his shaking hands to catch the papers. It was a federally approved search and seizure warrant, signed by a district judge 2 hours prior. The bold ink authorized the immediate confiscation of all electronic devices, financial records, and real estate documents contained within the property. Preston stared at the front page, his eyes darting across the dense paragraphs. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow shell. He began to violently shake his head in pure denial. "There must be some kind of mistake," Preston stammered, his voice cracking and pitching upward in panic. "You do not understand the situation. My father is heavily medicated. He does not know what he is saying. You cannot legally execute a search warrant based on the ravings of a delusional old man." Thomas Bennett, standing to the right of Agent Carter, let out a low, humorless laugh. He adjusted his winter coat and looked up at my son with absolute professional disgust. "We do not need your father's testimony to enter your house, Preston," the brilliant attorney stated smoothly. "We already possess the meticulously detailed master ledger you so carelessly left unlocked on your kitchen island. We possess every single routing number, every hidden offshore account, and every fraudulent shell corporation you established to launder cartel cash." Preston stopped breathing. The papers trembled violently in his hands. While Preston stood frozen in a state of shock, Monica recognized the inescapable reality of their doom. She had always been the apex predator in their vile partnership, possessing a sharp, ruthless survival instinct. She stood near the open doorway, her dark eyes darting rapidly across the front lawn, calculating her odds of evasion. She saw the 4 armed tactical agents blocking the primary driveway. She saw the neighborhood slowly waking up, peering through their frosted windows to witness the massive federal raid. Monica took one slow step backward into the warm foyer. She turned her body, attempting to casually blend into the shadows of the hallway leading toward the rear of the house. She dropped her tissue onto the floor and began to silently creep away, intending to slip through the sliding glass patio doors and disappear into the snow-covered woods. She moved with the quiet desperation of a cornered animal, her heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood. She reached the end of the hallway, practically tasting the bitter cold air of freedom. She lunged forward, grabbing the brass handle of the wooden back door, pulling it open with a sudden yank. She did not find the empty backyard she was hoping for. 2 massive armored federal agents stood perfectly still on the back deck, their tactical rifles resting against their ballistic vests. They completely blocked the narrow wooden staircase, standing shoulder to shoulder like an impenetrable wall of solid steel. Monica let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward in horror. "Going somewhere, ma'am?" the taller agent asked, his voice entirely devoid of any warmth. Monica did not answer. She slowly backed away, retreating into the center of the kitchen, her hands raised in a gesture of pathetic surrender. She looked back toward the front door, realizing with terrifying clarity that the federal authorities had surrounded the entire perimeter of the house. I stepped back inside the house, leaving Preston trembling on the front porch, under the strict, watchful eyes of Agent Carter and his squad. The warm air of the foyer rushed over my face, but it did nothing to thaw the absolute ice flowing through my veins. I walked slowly past my son, moving toward the spacious living room. The room was perfectly immaculate, decorated with expensive leather furniture, modern art, and a highly sophisticated sound system. Preston and Monica loved to entertain their shallow corporate friends with loud music, relying heavily on the ceiling-mounted speakers seamlessly integrated throughout the first floor. I reached into the pocket of my wool coat and pulled out the encrypted burner phone. The small device felt incredibly heavy in my hand, carrying the agonizing weight of my wife's final moments. I unlocked the screen, my thumb navigating the digital interface with calm, unwavering precision. I activated the wireless connection protocol and synced the device directly to the central entertainment hub mounted on the living room wall. The digital display on the receiver flashed brightly, confirming a successful high-definition audio pairing. I looked around the room, taking in the luxurious surroundings purchased with the stolen life of my beautiful Beatrice. Monica stood shivering near the kitchen island, her dark eyes wide with mounting dread as she watched my calculated movements. Preston finally stumbled through the front door, his face buried in his hands, completely broken by the sudden catastrophic destruction of his entire world. He slumped against the wall, weeping pathetic tears. He was crying for his prison sentence. He was not crying for his mother. I looked down at the screen of the burner phone. I opened the media player and selected the extracted file from Beatrice's hidden hard drive. I turned the volume output to its absolute maximum capacity. I did not say a single word. I simply looked directly at my son, held his terrified gaze, and pressed the bright green play button. A sharp burst of audio static hissed through the premium ceiling speakers, instantly followed by the clear, unmistakable sound of Beatrice's voice. The entire house violently echoed with the horrifying audio of Monica and Preston casually watching my wife die. The high-fidelity speakers mounted flawlessly inside the vaulted ceiling delivered every agonizing frequency with absolute clarity. The crisp digital audio bounced off the expensive artwork and resonated against the polished hardwood floors, filling the grand living space with the unmistakable sound of sheer, unadulterated evil. My wife was fighting for her final breaths, her desperate, suffocating gasps vibrating through the pristine acoustic environment. And layered perfectly over her dying struggle was the sound of Monica laughing. It was a cold, arrogant chuckle captured forever in digital permanence, followed by her callous suggestion to step out onto the patio and let nature take its course. The sheer volume of the playback hit Monica like a physical blow to her chest. She stood frozen near the kitchen island, her manicured hands trembling violently as her own wicked voice echoed through the house. The arrogant, untouchable predator who had spent the last 5 years terrorizing this family was instantly shattered. I watched her dark eyes widen until they were completely consumed by blind, paralyzing terror. She looked wildly toward the front door, seeing Agent Carter and the heavily armed tactical squad standing as silent witnesses to her monstrous crime. She looked toward the hallway, knowing the rear exit was equally blocked by federal agents. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. The absolute reality of her impending imprisonment crashed down upon her shoulders. Her perfectly tailored dark dress suddenly seemed like a burial shroud. Monica let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. Her knees buckled beneath her, completely unable to support the weight of her horrific guilt. She collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, her designer shoes scraping awkwardly against the wood. The psychological shock violently overwhelmed her physical body. She doubled over, clutching her stomach, as severe, uncontrollable nausea seized her. Monica violently vomited directly onto the pristine floor she had so proudly claimed as her own just 24 hours prior. She gasped for air, sobbing into the mess, reduced to a trembling, broken shell of a human being. I felt absolutely no pity for her. Preston was faring no better. The audio recording continued to play, shifting to the chilling sound of his own dead, emotionless voice confidently explaining how they had incinerated Beatrice's life-saving medication. The sound of his calculated admission drove the final nail into his coffin. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the floorboards as he desperately tried to retreat from the overwhelming wall of undeniable evidence. He backed up until his spine collided forcefully with the painted plaster wall. He stood there, pressed flat against the drywall, his breath coming in shallow, frantic bursts. His eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately searching for any possible loophole, any conceivable exit from this waking nightmare. He looked at the federal search warrant trembling in his own hand. He looked at the armed agents securing the perimeter. He looked at the shattered, weeping form of his wife on the floor. Finally, his panicked gaze locked directly onto my face. He saw the cold, unyielding clarity in my eyes. He realized that the dementia, the shaking hands, the slurred words, and the crushed sedatives had all been an elaborate, meticulously engineered performance designed specifically to trap him in his own arrogance. The profound realization broke the final remaining pillar of his fragile sanity. Preston let out a loud, agonizing cry. It was not a cry of genuine remorse for the mother he had murdered. It was the selfish, terrified wail of an arrogant man watching his freedom evaporate into thin air. His legs gave out completely. He slid down the painted wall and fell heavily to his knees. He dropped the federal warrant, crawling forward across the floorboards until he was only a few feet away from where I stood. "Dad." Preston screamed, his voice shattering into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. "Dad, please listen to me. You have to listen to me." I did not want to do it. Real desperate tears streamed down his pale cheeks, soaking the collar of his expensive navy blazer. He held his shaking hands out toward me, begging for a mercy he had explicitly denied his own mother. "The cartel made me do it, Dad. They were threatening my life. They told me that if I did not clear the financial audit and wash their money, they were going to murder all of us." I was terrified. I was only trying to protect our family. I was forced into it. The blatant, disgusting lie hung in the air, instantly contradicted by the audio recording still hissing from the ceiling speakers. I stared down at my son kneeling on the floor. I observed his pathetic, weeping face, his ruined clothing, and his desperate, clawing hands. I searched my heart for even a single microscopic trace of paternal affection. I searched for the father who had taught this boy how to ride a bicycle, who had proudly paid for his business degree, and who had trusted him with the keys to my entire financial empire. I found absolutely nothing. That father had died the moment Beatrice took her final breath. "I am your son," Preston wailed, his voice echoing with profound desperation. He crawled 1 inch closer, desperately trying to grab the edge of my wool winter coat. "Please, Dad, do not let them take me away. Do not let them lock me in a federal prison. I am your blood. Blood is blood. You cannot do this to your own family." I stepped back, ensuring his frantic, grasping hands found nothing but empty air. I looked down at him with an expression of absolute, terrifying zero empathy. The emotional void in my chest was completely cold and perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout. I spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that sliced cleanly through his pathetic sobbing. "I am entirely sane, Preston," I stated calmly, the words dropping like heavy stones onto the hardwood floor. "I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly who you are." I paused, letting the silence stretch between us as the final seconds of the audio recording faded into static. Preston looked up at me, his tear-soaked face trembling with a desperate, foolish hope that my silence indicated a sudden change of heart. I shattered that hope with a single devastating sentence. "You threw your blood in the shredder the exact moment you murdered my wife," I said, my voice completely devoid of any human warmth. Preston let out a breathless gasp, his entire body deflating, as the absolute finality of my words completely crushed him. He slumped forward onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably into his hands. Monica continued to sob violently near the kitchen island, unable to even lift her head. The illusion of their powerful, wealthy life was completely and permanently shattered. But I was not entirely finished. Securing his physical imprisonment was only the first phase of my calculated retribution. I wanted to ensure that when he sat in his concrete cell for the rest of his natural life, he understood the absolute magnitude of his financial devastation. I did not want him clinging to the false hope that his cartel debts would somehow be magically forgiven. I turned my head slightly, breaking my gaze away from my weeping son. I looked toward the front doorway, where the tactical squad stood waiting with perfect discipline. I locked eyes with my private attorney, who stood holding his thick leather briefcase. I gave him a single sharp nod. I signaled Thomas Bennett to step forward. Bennett adjusted the collar of his suit jacket and walked slowly into the grand living room, his hard leather shoes echoing with absolute authority. He stopped directly next to where Preston was kneeling on the floor. Bennett looked down at my son with a chilling professional smirk. He popped the brass clasps of his briefcase, the sharp metallic click instantly silencing Preston's pathetic crying. The next phase of absolute destruction was ready to commence. Thomas Bennett stood tall in the center of my expansive living room. The brilliant attorney projected an aura of absolute unforgiving authority. He looked down at my weeping son with a gaze so entirely devoid of pity that it made the freezing winter wind outside seem warm by comparison. Bennett slowly raised his expensive leather briefcase and placed it deliberately onto the polished surface of the coffee table. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches echoing through the silent house sounded exactly like the locking mechanism of a prison cell door closing permanently. Preston abruptly stopped crying. He wiped his tear-soaked face with his trembling hands and looked up at Bennett, severe confusion fighting through his overwhelming terror. "Who are you?" Preston stammered, his voice hoarse and pathetic. "What is going on here? Why is a lawyer standing in my house?" Bennett did not bother to answer him directly. He calmly reached inside his briefcase and retrieved a crisp, formal legal document encased within a dark blue protective folder. I recognized it instantly. It was the exact same stack of paper Preston had so violently slammed onto the dining room table the previous night. Preston stared at the folder, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically between Bennett and myself. A sudden, desperate spark of false hope flickered across his pale face. He genuinely believed that the document inside that folder was his ultimate salvation, his golden ticket. "That is my medical power of attorney," Preston shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at the blue folder. "He signed it last night." I watched him sign it with my own eyes. He willingly surrendered full legal control of his entire commercial estate directly to me. I am the sole executor of his finances. You cannot touch those assets. They belong to me now. He is legally incompetent. Bennett offered a slow, incredibly dark smile that chilled the room. He gracefully opened the protective folder and extracted the thick stack of papers. He held the document up under the bright recessed lighting, ensuring that Preston could clearly see the black ink of my signature on the final page. "You are absolutely correct about one thing," Preston Bennett stated, his voice resonating with lethal, measured precision. "Your father did indeed sign this specific piece of paper last night. However, you severely underestimated the man you were trying to destroy. You assumed his mind was broken, but his intellect remains infinitely sharper than yours will ever be." Bennett cleared his throat, holding the document with both hands. He looked directly down into those terrified eyes and prepared to shatter his reality. "I highly suggest you listen very closely," Bennett continued, "because the legal text contained within these pages does not grant you medical guardianship, nor does it transfer a single penny of the vast financial portfolio." Preston scrambled backward across the hardwood floor, his breathing growing increasingly shallow and erratic. "What are you talking about?" he gasped, panic saturating every single syllable. "I printed that document myself. It gives me complete authority." Bennett ignored his pathetic protests and began to read aloud from the meticulously forged middle pages. "This document constitutes a sworn, legally binding, and fully irrevocable confession of gross financial fraud. Bennett read his tone authoritative and echoing through the quiet house. I, Preston Cole, do hereby accept sole, undivided legal and financial responsibility for the entirety of the $12 million illicit debt fraudulently acquired through the use of unauthorized commercial loans, forged signatures, and shell corporations designed for money laundering. No, Preston screamed, his voice cracking violently. No, that is not what that paper says. You switched the pages. You framed me. He tried to lunge forward desperately, trying to snatch the document from Bennett, but two heavily armed federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing his shoulders and shoving him ruthlessly back down onto the floor. Bennett simply adjusted his reading glasses and continued reading the legal trap I had engineered. I completely and permanently indemnify Harrison Cole from any and all financial liabilities, criminal associations, or cartel debts incurred by my real estate enterprise. Bennett read perfectly. This document transfers the absolute burden of the $12 million illicit debt securely and permanently onto my personal Social Security number. Preston clutched his chest, gasping for air, as if he were physically suffocating. He looked at me, his face twisted into an expression of profound, agonizing horror. You tricked me, he whispered weakly, completely shattered. You set me up. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I stood directly over him, looking down at the broken, miserable creature who had casually murdered my wife. I slowly crouched down until my face was only a few inches away from his trembling ear. I wanted to ensure he heard every single word I was about to say. I needed him to understand the absolute permanence of his destruction before the federal authorities dragged him away into the freezing morning. That perfectly binding legal document was instantly filed with the federal court system, the exact second the electronic registry opened this morning. I whispered, my voice completely devoid of mercy. It is locked securely into the permanent public record. You do not have my money, Preston. You do not have my property. You have absolutely nothing. You possess zero assets to negotiate with. I paused, letting the cold reality settle deep into his bones. Furthermore, I made absolutely certain that your cartel handlers received a certified copy of that exact same document an hour ago. They already know that you are completely undeniably broke, and they currently believe you are actively cooperating with the federal authorities to save yourself. The absolute gravity of my words struck him with the devastating force of a freight train. His mind visibly fractured. He realized he was not merely facing decades inside a federal penitentiary for massive financial fraud and the deliberate murder of his own mother. He was now a marked man. The ruthless cartel he had foolishly tried to manipulate now knew he possessed absolutely no money to repay his massive debt, and they genuinely believed he had traded their organizational secrets for a reduced prison sentence. He would never be safe again, not on the streets, and certainly not behind the concrete walls of a federal prison. He was utterly ruined financially, legally, and mortally condemned. The psychological pressure became entirely unbearable for him. Preston stared blankly at the polished hardwood floor, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. He looked toward Monica, desperately seeking some kind of salvation, but she was already handcuffed, sobbing violently as two federal agents dragged her toward the door. She did not even look at him. She was completely broken, ruined by her own arrogance. Preston realized he was entirely alone. The massive, beautiful house he had stolen now felt like a suffocating tomb. Agent Carter stepped forward quickly, seizing Preston by his trembling shoulders. He hauled my son aggressively to his feet, ignoring the hysterical wailing. Carter pulled his arms behind his back with practiced mechanical efficiency. The heavy metal handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a sharp, satisfying finality. It was over. The heavy steel handcuffs locked Preston's wrists tightly behind his back, forcing his shoulders into an awkward, rigid posture. He continued to scream, a shrill, completely unhinged sound that echoed against the vaulted ceilings of the living room. Two massive tactical agents grabbed him firmly by his upper arms and hauled him toward the front hallway. His expensive Italian leather shoes dragged uselessly across the polished hardwood floors he had been so incredibly proud of just yesterday. He thrashed and twisted desperately, trying to pull away from their iron grip, but his frantic struggles were entirely pathetic. Monica was walking ahead of him, escorted by another pair of federal agents. She was not screaming. She was completely silent, her head bowed deeply, her dark hair falling forward to hide her tear-streaked, ruined face. The sheer terror of her reality had finally broken her mind, plunging her into a catatonic state of absolute defeat. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, my hands resting casually in the pockets of my wool coat, watching the two monsters being forcibly removed from my presence. I felt absolutely no sadness. I felt no grief. I felt only the cold, precise satisfaction of a structural engineer who had just successfully executed the controlled demolition of a highly toxic building. The heavy front door was pushed wide open, allowing the freezing winter air to rush into the foyer. The agents marched Preston and Monica out onto the front porch, forcing them to descend the brick steps. The neighborhood had fully awakened to the unprecedented spectacle. Our affluent, usually quiet street was lined with curious spectators. People stood on their manicured lawns, clutching their morning coffee mugs, their eyes wide with profound shock. Several neighbors were holding up their cellular phones, actively recording the stunning downfall of the young, arrogant couple who had always treated everyone with thinly veiled disdain. Preston saw the crowd and tried to hide his face, turning his head away from the merciless camera lenses. "Help me," he sobbed, his voice cracking as he looked toward a neighbor he occasionally played golf with. "Please call a lawyer. They are making a huge mistake." The neighbor simply took a step backward, shaking his head in silent disgust. No one was going to intervene. No one was going to offer a lifeline to a man who had built his life on a foundation of absolute cruelty. The federal agents did not hesitate. They guided Monica toward the first dark cruiser parked aggressively on the frosted grass. An agent pressed a heavy hand against the top of her head, guiding her down into the cramped, caged back seat. The heavy metal door slammed shut, with a sharp, resounding finality, permanently sealing her fate. Preston was dragged toward the second vehicle. He fought against the agents one final time, digging the heels of his shoes into the frozen gravel. He twisted his neck, trying to look back at the house, trying to find my face in the shadows of the doorway. He wanted one last chance to beg, one last opportunity to exploit the paternal bond he had so viciously severed. I did not step forward to meet his gaze. I remained deep inside the house, standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas Bennett, watching from the safety of the foyer. The agents shoved Preston roughly into the back of the second cruiser, securing the door behind him. The flashing blue and red lights painted the snow-covered street in harsh, rhythmic flashes. The engines roared to life, and the heavy vehicles slowly pulled away from the property, carrying my treacherous son and his wicked wife toward a lifetime of concrete walls, federal interrogations, and the looming, terrifying shadow of cartel vengeance. The silence that fell over the property was profound and incredibly heavy. The toxic presence that had suffocated me for 5 long years was finally gone. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the clean, crisp winter air fill my lungs. Agent Carter walked back up the porch steps, his boots thumping solidly against the wood. He paused at the threshold, taking off his tactical gloves. He looked at me with a genuine expression of professional respect. He extended his right hand. I reached out and took it, returning his firm, steady grip. "It is done, Harrison." Agent Carter stated, his voice calm and deeply reassuring. "They are in federal custody and the transport is secure. The warrants have been fully executed across all of his known accounts. We are officially seizing this entire property today. Every single piece of furniture, every vehicle, and every bank account connected to this address is now frozen under the asset forfeiture protocols. I understand you need to vacate the premises immediately. Our team will begin the comprehensive search and inventory process in 10 minutes. I nodded slowly, looking around the grand foyer one final time. I felt absolutely no attachment to the expensive chandeliers, the imported rugs, or the custom cabinetry. I did not care that the federal government was seizing the property. Preston and Monica had purchased this house using dirty laundered money, building a monument to their own vile greed. It was a tainted structure, and I was more than happy to let it fall into the hands of the state. My true wealth, the legitimate fortune I had built over 40 years of honest, grueling engineering work, was completely secure. I had liquidated the vast majority of my holdings months ago, transferring the clean capital into an impenetrable blind trust managed exclusively by Thomas Bennett and his elite legal team. The cartel could not touch it. The federal government had no jurisdiction over it, and my treacherous son had never even known it existed. I walked over to the bottom of the grand staircase. My small canvas duffel bag was still resting exactly where I had dropped it earlier that morning. I reached down and grabbed the thick leather handle. I slung the bag over my right shoulder. It contained only a few changes of clothes, some essential toiletries, and the framed photograph of Beatrice that I had taken from the nightstand. That was all I needed. I had absolutely no desire to take anything else from this poisoned environment. I turned back to Agent Carter and gave him a brief, appreciative nod. I pulled the heavy brass house key from my coat pocket and placed it neatly onto the console table. I stepped over the threshold and walked out onto the front porch for the absolute final time. The freezing wind kissed my cheeks, but I felt incredibly warm. I felt a tremendous sense of liberation, a profound lifting of the suffocating weight I had carried since the horrible night Beatrice died. I walked down the brick steps, my shoes crunching steadily over the frost-covered gravel. I did not look back at the grand, imposing facade of the seized house. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the street ahead. Thomas Bennett was already waiting for me at the end of the driveway. He stood next to a sleek black town car holding the rear passenger door open with a respectful, professional posture. I reached the vehicle and paused for a brief moment, looking down the quiet, tree-lined street. The flashing lights of the federal cruisers had long since disappeared into the distance. The neighborhood was slowly returning to normal. I turned to Bennett. "You performed flawlessly today." "Thomas," I said, my voice steady and clear. "The legal trap was executed with absolute perfection." Bennett offered a slight, knowing smile. "It was a privilege to assist you, Harrison," he replied smoothly. "Your instructions were precise. The trust is completely secure, and your new accommodations in the city are fully prepared and waiting for your arrival." I nodded, slipping into the warm, luxurious leather interior of the back seat. Bennett closed the heavy door behind me, sealing out the bitter winter cold. He walked around the rear of the vehicle and climbed into the driver's seat. The powerful engine purred quietly, vibrating with a soothing, consistent rhythm. I placed my canvas duffel bag onto the seat beside me. I unzipped the top compartment and carefully pulled out the framed photograph of Beatrice. I held the picture in my hands, tracing the outline of her beautiful, smiling face with my thumb. I had fulfilled my promise to her. I had delivered the absolute devastating justice she deserved. The villains who had mocked her dying gasps were now facing an eternity of misery and terror. Bennett shifted the vehicle into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. We glided smoothly down the street, leaving the seized property far behind us. I looked out the tinted window, watching the bare winter trees passing by in a continuous blur. I was completely free, holding a massive, untouched fortune, and possessing a mind sharpened by the fires of profound betrayal. But my mission was not entirely complete. I thought about the thousands of other vulnerable parents, the aging men and women who were currently suffering in silence, trapped in their own homes, emotionally and financially abused by the treacherous children they had sacrificed everything to raise. I leaned back against the plush leather headrest, my eyes narrowing with a dark, determined focus. I had successfully engineered the destruction of my own toxic family. Now it was time to utilize my vast resources, my brilliant legal team, and my unforgiving intellect to begin the final phase of my master plan. I was going to systematically build an inescapable network of protection, ensuring that absolutely no one else's family could ever do this to them again. 6 months later, the wheels of justice finally ground to a devastating halt for my son and his wife. The highly publicized federal trial was a relentless, agonizing exposure of their infinite greed. I sat in the front row of the polished mahogany courtroom every single day, observing the grim proceedings with quiet satisfaction. Preston and Monica sat heavily at the defense table wearing standard-issue orange jumpsuits, their previous arrogance completely replaced by hollow, trembling terror. The cartel had already seized all of their illicit hidden foreign assets, leaving them entirely reliant on desperate court-appointed public defenders. The undeniable evidence we had meticulously gathered over those agonizing months was utterly insurmountable. The hidden audio recordings, the forged legal documents, and the master financial ledger painted a horrifying, indisputable picture of their immense cruelty. When the federal judge finally handed down the official sentencing, the silence in the courtroom was incredibly heavy. Preston and Monica were officially convicted of second-degree murder, massive federal wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. The judge looked down at them with profound disgust and delivered the ultimate punishment. They were both sentenced to 45 years in a harsh maximum security federal penitentiary, entirely without the possibility of parole. Monica collapsed immediately, sobbing violently into her chained hands. Preston turned his head desperately, looking back at me with wide, pleading eyes. I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of forgiveness. I simply turned my back and walked out of the double doors, leaving them to their concrete eternity. With my toxic bloodline permanently severed, I dedicated the entirety of my remaining existence and my vast, secure fortune to a singular vital purpose. I established the Beatrice Cole Foundation. It was not a traditional passive charity. It was an aggressive, highly mobilized strike force designed specifically to hunt predators who target the vulnerable. I personally employed elite top-tier forensic accountants, seasoned private investigators, and dedicated legal experts. We provided immediate, overwhelmingly powerful protection for elderly individuals who were being silently exploited by their own predatory relatives. We audited suspicious accounts, installed covert security systems, and severed toxic legal guardianships. We became the impenetrable shield that Beatrice and I never had. Every single time our powerful foundation saved a frightened, isolated victim from a greedy son or a manipulative daughter, I felt my beautiful wife smiling down upon me. On a crisp, quiet autumn morning, precisely 6 months after the trial concluded, I walked slowly through the incredibly peaceful grounds of the city memorial park. The biting wind scattered golden leaves across the manicured grass. I wore my heavy black wool coat against the biting frost, but my posture was perfectly straight, and my rhythmic steps were incredibly firm. I finally reached the familiar polished marble headstone, the engraved letters of Beatrice's name catching the early morning sunlight. I knelt down gently and placed a single, flawless white rose directly against the cold stone. I rested my hand upon the marble, feeling a profound, absolute peace finally settle deep within my weary soul. I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air clear my mind. The foundation is solid now, ba. I whispered softly into the gentle morning breeze, my voice steady and entirely clear. We are saving them. We are protecting the innocent. No one will ever tear it down. I lingered for a few quiet moments, absorbing the serene silence of the sacred grounds. I stood back up, adjusting my coat against the chill. The brutal, suffocating nightmare that had relentlessly consumed my life was permanently over. The toxic structure was demolished, and a beautiful, enduring fortress had been built in its place. I turned away from the grave and walked steadily down the paved path, leaving the dark shadows of the past far behind me where they belonged. My dignity was fully restored, my heart was finally healed, and my remaining years belonged entirely to me. The most dangerous predators rarely break through your windows. They have a key to your front door and call you family. Trust is a beautiful gift, but blind trust is a dangerous liability. When intuition whispers that something is wrong, listen to it. Age does not equate to weakness, and love should never be an excuse to tolerate abuse. True strength lies in the courage to face reality, no matter how painful, and the willingness to protect your dignity at all costs. You owe nothing to those who view your life as a disposable asset. Have you ever felt exploited by someone you trusted with all your heart? How did you take your power back? Share your story in the comments below. If Harrison's fight for justice inspired you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another story.